Ooh. Well, hello everyone. Looks like we are up and going. Sorry about that. I had a couple of issues trying to get Facebook's live video system to start up, but it appears that we have it going now. I'm looking through my stuff because there was something I was hoping to be able to do tonight during the live stream. I was hoping to be able to do some screen sharing as we went through, but I cannot see a way to do that now that class has started. It looks like I can do an entire screen share presentation where all you ever see is my screen and not me, which may actually be better for everybody. But it won't let me do it now, which is a bit of a bummer. If you'll give me just a second to double check, because I want to be able to do this. Huh. Well, that's a bummer. Grand scheme of things, not a big deal, but I was hoping to get to do something a little bit different tonight, and it's not going to work. So, never mind. For right now, we'll just go back here and go ahead and get started. All right. So, if you have paid attention to the title, you can see that we are going to start a series from the book of Colossians tonight. That's going to be our kind of path of study for the next several weeks. And so for the sake of this evening, what I'm going to do is spend some time just giving you a background to the city of Colossae, what we know about the letter, what we don't know about the letter as far as when Paul wrote it, where Paul wrote it from, what was going on precisely in his life at the time. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Hopefully that means that I will be able to kind of get you set up for reading the letter itself. It would also help if the book that I had open in front of me was Colossians and not Ephesians. Set my Bible down and it flipped open to something else that I've been working on. So go ahead and get this open here, and then we will go ahead and get started. Cool. So, the city of Colossae, to whom the letter was written, or the church that met in Colossae were on the receiving end of the letter, it's a really interesting place in that most of the things that we have as far as letters that are written in the New Testament are written to places that, large cities, fairly important places, for any number of reasons. Rome obviously is a massively important city. The letter to the Romans is written to this large church community that's in this large metropolitan area. Ephesus is an important city. They're on the receiving end of Ephesians. Corinthians, Corinth is an important place in the ancient world. Colossae isn't. It just isn't. It's not on one of the major Roman trade routes. It's just off the major Roman trade route. So it's not difficult to get to, from the main road, but you've got to be going there to get there. It's not on the way from one place to another. The city itself had been large and important, dating back to the time when there was an Israel and a Judah. If you reach back into the history of the city, there are moments when it's a fairly important place, a place of some size. But by the time of the New Testament, all that has kind of gone away. And there are other towns nearby that may not have been as important in the past, but because of their location and them ending up on a major Roman trade route while Colossae doesn't, places like Laodicea City Laodicea end up being much bigger and much more important. And even like Hierapolis, which is a little bit off the road, but not as far off the road as Colossae has, gained some prominence. And it really did kind of come down to that. Your location as a community mattered, and it said, a lot about whether or not you got more people passing through your town. This is, not gone away by any stretch of the imagination. I remember growing up in small towns in Texas, and we always liked when there was a bypass built around the town so that you didn't have to go through the stoplights in the middle of the town that would slow you down getting to the next place. But the towns that got bypassed suffered economically in ways that towns that didn't get bypassed didn't suffer quite the same way. If you already have to stop, then you might as well take a stop downtown and get out. And Colossae was not a place where people were taking a stop downtown anymore. And then by the time, we don't know for certain when the letter was written. We've got some guesses. But before Paul dies, and before really he's even imprisoned in Rome, most likely, there's this massive earthquake in the same area that Colossae is in, and it strikes Laodicea, it strikes Hierapolis, and it strikes Colossae. And Laodicea rebuilds quickly, and in fact, they're very proud of the fact that they do so funded entirely by their own money. They accept no help from the Roman government. They just take care of it. Hierapolis rebuilds, albeit a little bit more slowly. Colossae doesn't rebuild at all. The town itself is destroyed. And while some people kind of rebuild their areas and there continues to be a community, it is no longer what it was before. And by the 8th century, so several hundred years after Paul writes, it ceases to be inhabited at all. And so one of the things that makes Colossae interesting for those of you who find these things interesting is the fact that of all the places that we get named off in the New Testament, so places like Corinth or Ephesus or Rome or Jerusalem or Colossae has never been excavated. There's never been any archaeological work done in Colossae. They haven't dug around the foundations of the old town. Nothing. They're not a thing has been done, which to me is absolutely fascinating because in a lot of ways the heart of the community ceases to exist after the earthquake. And there's no telling what we might find, especially if Paul writes to a church community in Colossae that existed early on and had a pretty good place in the community. There may be any number of things, including, no need to speculate, but there could be all sorts of awesome stuff there. And I would love for somebody to fund an excavation over there. If any of you out there in the world are... Well, that's good news. Larry, I got your message. And here I thought I managed to work out all of the problems. Well, that's a bit of a bummer. All right. I'm going to assume that you can hear me and keep talking because there's nothing I can do to fix the camera right now. And I can just hope that it's a temporary issue. So... Well, that's mildly distracting. Anyway, so back to the city and the area. We don't know much about the formation of the church in Colossae. Acts never tells us that Paul visits, but the town itself is not that far from Ephesus, where Paul was for a pretty good amount of time, a couple years. And so there's a chance always that Paul had visited. He certainly seems to know a number of people from Colossae. But the name that shows up the most in connection to Colossae is Epaphras, who is somebody who's a co-worker with Paul, somebody who's connected to his ministry. He's the one who brings a report to Paul about some of what's going on in the church in Colossae and the struggles that they're having. Um, and so uh, there's a very good chance, even if, Paul may have helped form an early church community there with a couple of people in it, that the early church planting work was really done by, probably Epaphras, who seems to have close ties to the community there. And so, in some ways, Paul is writing to a church of which he knows a handful of people, but may not really know the community. Um, but he's gotten this report from Epaphras of all of these struggles that the church is having, and he feels like he needs to offer some advice, some guidance, and weigh in on what's going on. And I think what we see here that he writes to, we can reconstruct a little bit, is helpful for us to study and understand because it's something that continues to happen to even through our day. We just don't necessarily look at it the exact same way. And the other thing that I think makes it kind of impactful is it's something that's been happening in a lot of ways for a very long time. The church in Colossae isn't dealing with anything that other churches don't deal with during their time period. They're not dealing with anything that the people of Israel aren't dealing with when the prophets write 800 years before this. And, of course, still dealing with some of it ourselves. And that is this kind of piecing together of religious life with a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of that and kind of throwing it all together to make it work. So there are a number of things that make the region that Colossae is in, Asia Minor, fascinating. They are, even though they are, 1,000 miles from Rome, they have a hyper-Roman mentality. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. So there are things taking place in Asia Minor during the first century, during the time period that Paul writes, where there are people like venerating the emperor as if he's a god. They're building temples to the emperor. They're building temples to Roman gods and goddesses left and right as quickly as they can put them up. Of course, Colossae is no different, and of course along the way they're trying to compete with their neighbors, because one of the things that towns tend to do is try and outdo their neighbors for places of importance, even more so for a place that had been important but no longer is, and maybe trying to regain a little bit of that. There's all sorts of religious cults that exist in Colossae itself. We know from historical records that were kind of passed down from even some of the early historians that there's a big fertility goddess cult there, and I probably don't have to explain what worship of the fertility goddess in the Roman world might have looked like. But there's a large cult of that. There's also a fairly large Jewish community that's in Colossae. It has been for a few hundred years by this point. What had happened for that community to grow had been that, especially the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom, as people were taken out of those kingdoms by Assyria and then Babylon, and resettled, and then resettled again, and then resettled again with an empire that could just pick up your community and move you somewhere. And what happened was about 10 or 20,000 Jewish, I was about to say refugees, but that's not the right word. It's the opposite of that. People who've been taken into captivity were relocated by the Babylonians to this area. And one of the things that makes that Jewish community different from, say, like a Jerusalem Jewish community is that they grow up with their own traditions. They can't really go back and visit the temple. So they approach things a little bit differently. They're obviously not going to put the emphasis on the sacrifice of animals at the temple. That's not going to be what's most important to that community. And so there are other aspects that become more important to that community. And so they may be Jewish, and they certainly keep many of the Jewish traditions, and they hold the same text sacred, but they don't necessarily approach it the same way. And so, there are aspects of that become important. And so you have all of this going on, and all of these different religious groups surrounding this church community. And the church community is made up of people that weren't Christians before, but are from this community. So, there are Jewish members of this church community that have this background of this Hellenistic Judaism. There are members of the community who were Gentiles, are Gentiles, and spent time worshiping in the temple to the fertility goddess. They were like all of those people have now come together and are trying to form this body. And one of the things that happens that was promoted by the Roman Empire itself and encouraged by people along the way, and so for people who'd grown up in Colossae with that mentality, kind of adopted and brought to church, is this idea of synchronism, which is where you take a piece of this and you take a piece of this. So you take some aspect of, let's say, Jewish food law that you've come across, maybe because it's held sacred by the member of your church community across from you who grew up, paying attention to Jewish food laws. And you take this aspect of Greek philosophy because that's important to your community, or maybe, and then you take this aspect of worship to the goddess of fertility, and you meld them together and make it what is comfortable, what you want it to be. And that's how you begin to approach things. Well, it looks like, based on a read-through of the entire book of Colossians, that's exactly what's taking place amongst a large portion of the church there in Colossae. They're not an old church. No church is old at this point. Paul is writing to a few people he knows and a lot that he doesn't. They've been learning and teaching and growing together, but that doesn't mean that you automatically get everything right from day one. We know that you don't automatically get everything right from day one. They're trying to figure things out, but they're piecing things together themselves, and Paul is trying to help guide them back in a direction that's meaningful. And the biggest thing for the book of Colossians to know and understand, and that we will see over and over as we read through it in the next several weeks, and I would encourage you, as always, to take the time, especially such a short book as it is, even tonight, sit down and read through the book of Colossians. The big idea that Paul pushes over and over and over is the supremacy and fullness, the completeness of Jesus and Jesus' work and what Jesus has called them to. And they don't need to add other stuff to it in order to attain salvation or to become more holy, or to, given some of the heresies that they're dealing with, in order to gain a better understanding or knowledge, or to secure their own passage into for those who are adopting Gnostic thought, the greater realms, higher wisdom, stuff like that. Jesus is enough. That's the message that Paul gives them over and over and over. And so when he talks about the good news that they had heard from the beginning, that Epaphras had taught them, that's it. That Jesus is enough. That Jesus has done everything they need, provided everything they need in order to attain, inherit, gain, receive, however you want to phrase that, the salvation of God. And they don't need to go looking for more. They don't need to go to other places, because what happens when stuff like that begins to spread out in a church then and now is that it becomes a competition. Who can follow God best? Who is the best Christian? Who is the most knowledgeable? And all of those competitions start and end in selfishness. And so the idea that they could gain, that they could attain, that they could earn, that they could learn to the next level, and then the next level, to be better and better and better, and doing so by taking a piece of this and a piece of that and making their own kind of religious program, which is what was happening, was just not going to be an acceptable path for them to travel, as far as Epaphras was concerned, as far as Paul was concerned, and as Paul writes, as far as Jesus is concerned. The message that we've inherited, even though we don't necessarily deal with the exact same struggles that are going on in the background for the church in Colossae, the message is an important one. Jesus is enough. I think we are still very tempted to try and do the same things that they did, albeit in different avenues. We're not necessarily worried about keeping perfect food laws, though you still see arguments for the Christian diet or some of the other stuff that I've seen out there along those lines. We don't necessarily worry about having all of the perfect knowledge in order to attain salvation as if it's some sort of checklist test, but it's very easy for us to speak about following God as if it's a checklist test. And I think those temptations, those challenges are still there for us today. All right. I think that's a good spot to wrap up as far as introducing the background to the letter of Colossians. What I really think is interesting, you'll notice this when you read through this tonight before you go to bed. Towards the end of the letter, and this is a throwaway line, for us if you don't know what you're looking for it. Paul writes to the church in Colossae that once they have read their letter, to swap it with the church in Laodicea and read the letter to the church in Laodicea, which means that whatever Paul had written to them is also going to be important for this other church to hear. So that tells us that their struggle is not unique, that there's, more layers going on. It also tells us that what Paul wrote to the church in Laodicea was going to be helpful and meaningful to the church in Colossae. And they're not the exact same thing, obviously, or else they wouldn't need to change letters. But we don't have a Laodiceans in our Bible. We don't have a letter that's written to them. So where is it? Well, there are a few options. One, it's lost. Two, it's actually the letter that we call Ephesians, because some of the names that show up in both letters are the same. The ideas are very similar, and nowhere in the book of Ephesians does Paul directly state who he's writing to, other than the first line, which, those headings have been added and pieced together. There's some manuscript issues there. And then the other thing is Ephesus is kind of at the heart of all of this. And maybe that's a third letter that they were all sharing at the same time. It's just really interesting to know what we have, what we may or may not be missing, and gives us a little bit of wonder as to what might be out there. I'm the type of person that hopes and looks forward to the moment that another manuscript is discovered. They're still finding manuscripts every once in a while that date back to early Christian history, early church days, and I think it would be really awesome if they're picking apart some papyrus mask in the near future and they find a piece of a letter written to Laodicea, and but again, that's neither here nor there. And if you don't love the history and background stuff like I do, I've wasted your time with that one. So take the time to read through the book of Colossians tonight. Pay attention to all the ways in which the supremacy of Christ is so central to the message. And then as we go through, I'll unpack a little bit more about how Paul, deals specifically with some of the early heresies, the early philosophies that find their way into churches that are not part of the gospel, but seem to be really enticing to church groups, and how Paul deals with that. So, glad you're with us. I will catch you again next week. Y'all have a good one.